Hey everybody, welcome back to Pick of the Week. This time I'm featuring the Shins with their album The Worm's Heart from 2018 on Columbia Records. So yeah, this is a really interesting release. So back in 2017, the Shins released Heartworms, and even at that time, James Mercer was experimenting with different versions of those songs. He even released some of them as singles ahead of this album. And then they decided to reimagine the whole album. So basically they were gonna flip it. The last song became the first song and the first song became the last song. You get that? But not only that, all of the songs, they reimagined them. So fast songs became slow songs became fast songs, and even stylistically it changed. Really interesting stuff. I love that they're experimenting and they were able to like release this album almost less than a year later. I had a lot of fun diving into this, and not only that, but exploring both albums at the same time. I would put one song on and be like, oh, that's cool, and then put on the other one. And I just loved hearing the differences, even though that structurally and lyrically they're the same song, but they're incredibly different. And there are cases where I prefer the original over these, but then there's also many times where I prefer these versions over the original. So with all that, let's go track by track. So opening up the album, we have the original album closer. This is called The Fear. And the original had kind of more of a Latin inspired feel, whereas this is much more rooted in indie rock. I really like that about this version. I also really like the guitar solos on here, which replaced the strings off of the original. The original was a great album closer. It had a nice sort of culmination vibe conclusion. So it's interesting to hear it as an album opener. It's a little subdued, I will say that, but it makes for kind of a groovy opening. I can't say I like one more than the other, but it's just, again, I'm gonna be repeating myself throughout this, but it's just cool to hear the same song done in a completely different style. Moving right along, we have So Now What, which has been transformed into this very 80s worthy slow jam, and it must be the 80s kid in me, but I absolutely love this version of it. Now, the original was a very bright, shimmery, Shins-esque song, very quintessential sound, and I have to admit, I'm not the biggest Shins fan. I enjoy their music, no doubt, but there are times when I would like to hear something different, and this song appeals to me because of that. It's a case where I prefer this flipped version over the original. Track 3 is what would have been the title track. This is Heartworms. The original had more of a 60s folky vibe with really great silky textures. This one, by contrast, feels much colder. It's got these electronic instruments and sounds which are in very much contrast to that more warm vibe of the original. Overall, I really enjoy this. I like both of the songs. I feel like I lean a little bit heavier towards this one just because it has more of that 80s sound that I really dig. I can't blame you. So track 4 is Dead Alive, and here things go for a darker turn. Oh yes, there's some solemn piano on here, there's some very melancholy strings. Overall, this is the polar opposite to the original. That being said, I have to say that I like the original more. This is a case where, as interesting and as different as this flipped version is, in my opinion, it doesn't really stand on its own. By stripping so much out of it and slowing it down, it sort of loses something in the process.
From my town I can always look down my nose at the fish in the barrels.
Rounding out side A, we have 500,000, and I am a sucker for ska and rocksteady, and this track certainly hits the sweet spot for me. I just love the vibe of this and how his vocals just sort of dance right on top of the other instruments so effortlessly, and just the visual I get with this song, it feels like one of those old-timey cartoons like Felix the Cat or Betty Boop, and I can totally see just a Cuphead inspired type new animation music video to this song. It's really fun. That being said, I also really enjoy the original, which has a much more electro pop feel. I think both songs are great. If you haven't heard the original, definitely check it out. Opening up side B, we have Rubber Balls, and this is my favorite flipped version. I love how understated it is. There's this sweet melancholy throughout this song, which is in a very sharp contrast to the original, which is much more 60s Beatle-esque. And this one just takes the original and just refines it to the point where I really prefer this version.
She wore Mardi Gras beads in her hair, and I just can't get her out of my bed. Should've gone with her sister instead.
My favorite part has to be the light vocalizations that just dance with the guitar parts during these instrumental sections. Track 2 is Mildenhall, and this one definitely has a 60s, early 60s pop influence. Just listen to that organ. It totally reminds me of the single Palisades part. The original had this much more kind of understated cowpoke feel, not quite country, not quite western, and not to say that this is bad or anything. It's just that it's not my taste. It's a little too stylized. I'm also not a huge fan of the organ solo breakdown where they kind of slow everything down and it just goes into overdrive, almost like Vanilla Fudge, but it feels a little heavy-handed. There's not a lot of finesse to it. It's really hitting those keys hard, just not my taste. I definitely prefer the original over this flipped version. Track 3 is Fantasy Island, and this is where we have that classic Shins sound. This to me is quintessential of their sound. It really reminds me of stuff off their first couple of albums. I really dig this song. The original had more of a Phil Spector 60s pop meets Molly Ringwald from the 80s kind of a vibe. Really interesting sounds. I really like both of them. I'm really split on which one I like more. They both have their merits. I will say that the organ on this flipped version is much more to my liking versus the previous song. Up next, we have Cherry Hearts, and I don't have a lot to say about this song because to me, this represents the element of the Shins that I don't really like. It's not that I don't like the Shins, it's just that there's some songs that I find kind of forgettable, and I don't know exactly what it is, but they're really shiny and pretty on the surface, and they're poppy and they're fun. You know, they're a little bit more commercial, and it's not necessarily something I really want to seek out. So that's kind of kept me from being a hardcore fan of the Shins. But the original has this almost Animal Collective feel about it. There's all these really interesting audio elements going on, and this just doesn't do it for me. I just, again, find it very interesting how subtle little changes in the production and arrangement can make a big impact on a song. Track 5, we have Painting a Hole. And this one's interesting because if you compare it to the original, tempo-wise, they're actually quite similar. It's just the instrumentation that's different. What I do like about this track is that there's these Stranger Things inspired breakdowns right after the chorus. But this is a case where I don't really have a preference. I like both versions equally. Last song on here is Name For You, and I am really digging the 80s sports montage vibe of this song. Now, the original had more of a Talking Heads meets country folk vibe, which I also really dug, and it made for a great album opener. So hearing this as an album closer is definitely interesting. I think it works. It leaves me very uplifted and inspired. So that's a really great feeling to close an album with. Okay, now on the packaging, what I really like is that even down to the image here, it is a flipped version. It's not a complete negative. There is some similarities between the two. In fact, I had to double check to make sure I was ordering the correct one. Right here, we have a hype sticker talking about features 11 new versions and includes a digital download. On the back there, you get track listings and a giant barcode. Now, somewhat disappointing is that there's nothing else. The record comes in a clear poly sleeve, and that's it. There's no inserts, there's no lyric stuff, there's no credits or thank yous even, just a digital download card. But you know what, that's all right. I have a feeling they kind of pushed this thing out there and they didn't really put a lot of expense into making it different. So here we have the labels, which I do like, and there is side B. Well, anyway, guys, I really enjoyed exploring this version of the album, and I encourage you guys to do the same. The Worms' Heart is an experiment. They had a lot of fun in the studio, and it's sort of mechanical in the way that these songs were put together. Like, the original album dictated how this album was gonna sound. So that being said, not all of it is a clear winner. It feels a little disjointed at times. It doesn't necessarily have a real even flow. As much as I like the idea of it, there are times when it just doesn't quite make it out of the gate. You know what I mean? It stumbles a little bit, but it's not a complete failure at the same time. It really is a fun listen, and I think longtime fans of the Shins are gonna have a great time making a custom playlist of their favorite versions of these two albums. But I want to know what you guys have to say. What do you think of this album? How would you count it in their discography? Do you have a favorite song off of here, or do you prefer a custom playlist of all these songs? Leave me a comment down below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I'm your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flipped side.